Welcome everyone to For the Love of Language. I'm EJ.
And I'm Stacy. Welcome, everybody. I'm so excited for our episode today.
Yeah, we have a fantastic, fun topic about language origin stories.
Yeah, like language myths, different cultures' ideas of how language came to be, or I found that more often than not, it's about how different languages came to be. Like the origin of language itself seems to just kind of be an innate, inherent thing, but there's a lot more stories about how different languages kind of came to be. So that's kind of where we're coming from on this.
Yeah, and I think we will touch a little bit on both,
Yes.
actually. But this is a little bit less of a hard historical linguistics topic because these are myths, these are fables, stories that have been passed down. So it's less about the technical theory and more about the story.
Yeah. If anything, this will be an examination of different cultures. If we're talking like academic stuff, we'll be talking about how different cultures talk about things. But like at the end of the day, this is kind of just like a fun little story time for all of us.
Yes. So let's maybe dive in and just
Yeah.
talk about some of these fun stories.
Yeah, so EJ is gonna start us off. They have a few different stories, and then I have a few. Let's start with the one about Norse mythology, about Nordic stuff.
Yeah. So this one is kind of interesting, but there's not like a lot of detailed information that I could find about it. But basically, in Norse mythology, you have Odin is a pretty well-known Norse god, Odin Allfather,
Hmm.
and Odin actually has brothers, Vili and Vi, and don't criticize my pronunciation there. I have no idea how those are actually supposed to be said. We'll just leave it at that.
I was gonna say, when we get to my stories, I'm gonna butcher some of these pronunciations. So forgive us. We're dealing with languages and cultures we're not necessarily familiar with.
Right. So we're gonna try, but yes, do just give us a little bit of grace here. But in Norse mythology, you have, Odin and his brothers Vili and Vi that are somewhat involved in the creation of the world. And so they, give life to the first few humans and give them their gifts. And one of the things that the god B just gives to humanity is language. So in the Norse mythology, language is literally just given from the gods, which I thought was pretty cool. I tried to validate this in a bunch of different sources. I have the Poetic Edda book, which mentions like very a little bit about Villian B, but on vikinger.org found some information that seemed pretty consistent across lots of sources that I was looking at. But yeah, I think, it's not an uncommon idea that language just came directly from the gods. And
Hmm.
so the Norse gods are just a good example of that.
Yeah, absolutely. There was one that I found here. In India. There's a couple different like stories about how language came to be, but there is like a goddess that is the goddess of speech or speech personified and is like the goddess of like sacred utterances. So that's really interesting, but there's also this idea floating around that there was this tree, this like world tree, and apparently it was like a naughty tree because Vishnu, like the tree was doing something and Vishnu decided to cut off its branches. And as Vishnu cut off the branches, that's kind of how different languages spread out. And so there's like a couple different ideas of like language and speech in Hinduism, in Indian culture. So that was kind of interesting as well, that there's like not only like a goddess for, or like a manifestation, a physical manifestation for speech, but also there is this idea of like a tree, like a big tree, and then as the branches broke off, different languages came to be.
Very cool.
Yeah.
That kind of leads pretty well into the Christian stories, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk a little bit about the Bible. So I think there's two things in the Bible that are kind of interesting when it comes to the origins of language. You have in the Gospel of John, chapter 1, verse 1, and I'm just going to read this verse. It is, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God."
Oh, actually, I'm glad you brought this up. I made a TikTok about this, um, based on somebody else's TikTok, and like there's you could interpret this like so many ways, and that's
Oh,
kind of
yeah.
what I was talking about, was like the interpretation of it and like a potential mythos you could build around it. That's something that I explored in my TikTok. But yeah, it was this idea of like God is the Word and the Word is God, and they were kind of like simultaneous.
Yeah. Which is like, and there's going to be people that interpret this very symbolically and, think of the word as something else. And there's going to be people that interpret this very literally, as with, everything in the Bible. There's going to be lots of different interpretations of it.
And translations are going to show different things. There's awesome scholars all over like TikTok and stuff who talk about this. There's like actual, like formal research that's been done on this verse.
Oh, yes. It's a cool verse. It's
It
a cool
is.
verse. But I think one cool interpretation would be that, language existed in the beginning with God. And I think if you go back to like Genesis 1 in the Old Testament of the Bible and the creation of the world, on the different days, God creates the seas, the animals, eventually creates the people, and the people are already talking, right?
Mm-hmm.
In the Bible, like Adam is already talking when he's created. And so I think, that comes back to this idea of like language just always was. It was a gift from God, kind of the same as the Norse mythology, or, lots of different ones show, which is cool.
Yeah, it is really cool. And kind of like in conjunction with that, there's a lot of talks within like linguistics communities about like the universality of language, right? Because there are some people who believe that there is sort of like one underlying language that's like within all of us. And there are some people out there, and I'm not necessarily going to say that they're scholars or anything. Like this is just kind of a belief that floats around with this idea of like universal grammar and like, one underlying language with like that's inside all of us. It's this idea of an Adamic language is how they call it. So like the original language of Adam, that like first person's like language that God gave them, that is like the language that's inside all of us, but it's because of like all of these external factors that we get like, variations in that. So it is kind of like an interesting concept that is definitely influenced. I mean, we all know that we're in like a Western civilization that's heavily like Christian influenced. It's like how much of that idea of like a universal language or a universal grammar comes from that idea of, oh, there was like one pure language and then shit hit the fan and all of a sudden we have like different stuff. But there is like one true and pure language that was God given, that like Adamic language. So there's some really interesting like concepts that kind of build off of that idea of like God gave like the perfect language and then people corrupted it. But yeah, it's very fascinating, and it's, again, I won't say one way or another, but that like mythos has definitely kind of permeated through linguistic science even.
Yeah, it's hard to separate culture from every other aspect of
Mm-hmm.
science, and especially where language is so dynamic and changes so much. Like culture impacts language and language impacts culture. Like it would almost be surprising if our cultural history didn't impact the way that we view the sciences.
Yeah.
But that gets into like a really interesting topic on its own.
We can save that for another day, but that's just kind of an interesting point I wanted to throw out. But there is more about the Bible and language dissemination myths.
Let's go there. I love that segue.
Yeah.
So that was, I guess, the beginning of the world, right? As far as the Bible goes. And obviously we could spend like entire episodes talking about any one of these stories, but we're just going to be doing a fun kind of quick pass over a lot of them.
Yep.
But yeah, not very far into the Bible, in Genesis chapter 11, you have the story of the Tower of Babel, or some people say Babel. I'm just going to say Babel.
I grew up with saying Babel, or no, Babel. Babel. I said Babel, not Babel.
We don't even know what we call it because we've
we don't
heard
even
both
know.
ways.
Yeah, everyone's heard it both ways, but yes, the Tower of Babel.
Yeah. And you know what? This is actually like really, really short. How about I just read this one as well?
Go for it.
The whole story is really short. So here is EJ's reading of the Bible, Genesis 11. Now the whole world had one language and a common speech. As people moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there. They said to each other, "Come, let's make bricks and bake them thoroughly." They used brick instead of stone and tar for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we will be scattered over the face of the earth." But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower the people were building. The Lord said, "If as one people speaking the same language they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language so they will not understand each other." So the Lord scattered them from there over all the earth, and they stopped building the city. That is why it was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole world. From there the Lord scattered them over the face of the whole earth. So that's the NIV version of the Bible. You'll find, slightly different translations will, of course, phrase it a little bit differently. But the way that I was, taught about this in Sunday school as a kid was like that people were so, vain. They wanted to build this tower to reach the heavens. And that was not a very... they were basically wanting to physically reach God, like a very prideful kind of thing to do. And so the Lord stopped it and scattered them and their language, right? That's probably like not the best way to describe this, but that's the story more or less.
Yeah. And what's really interesting is, as I was digging around, apparently there are like very similar myths, kind of like there's similar myths about like a great flood. There's also a variety of myths about a tower that was built to reach God, and then because that was like not good, people's language changed because of it. So one of them is a Pacific island in Polynesia, where they attempted to erect a building to see the creator god Vatea, but the god broke the building down and broke down their language, so that they couldn't work on it. Another one in Southeast Asia, in Geico, something like that. So in Southeast Asia, very similarly, they were trying to build a pagoda to reach heaven, and then God came down and confounded their language so that they couldn't work on the pagoda anymore, and that's how different languages came to be. So this isn't like an abnormal thing. This is in a couple different places where this idea of trying to become like God and that not being necessarily desirable, and then people confusing their language, or getting their language confused by the God.
So it's like the separation of language and the creation of these different language families is a punishment for humanity's hubris.
Yeah, yeah. It's really, really fascinating how, a bunch of different cultures have that like same idea of like, oh, because like getting languages like a pun like having different languages is a punishment.
which is super, super interesting. And again, like these stories, some people do take them literally,
Hmm.
and a lot of people take them figuratively as well. But that in a lot of cultures, that is the story of the origin of language, is that it's maybe if people had been more righteous, then you would still have one language, is again, I think the other side of that coin coming from that belief system, which I think also brings, down the road things that we've talked about of like ideas of linguistic superiority, like
Hmm.
do you have the promised, the chosen people whose language is closer to God's original language, the Adamic language, like
Hmm.
these myths bring about other myths and other ideas that are still very prevalent in cultures everywhere.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really fascinating. And in talking about this, we've talked about, a few of these different myths from a few different places that are very similar. And one that I was really curious about investigating was Aboriginal or like a Native Australian myths. And this is Australia has one of the largest, most diverse language families. We've talked about it a little bit. And so there's a lot of different like cultures, ideas, and general belief systems around the continent. But I was really curious what they had to say because a few different cultures in Australia have this idea of dream time, of like a time before like what we experience now as life, where like animals could talk and the world kind of worked in a different way. So I was curious what these people like might have believed about language. And so one of the myths that I found, and again, this is from like a small group. I'm sure there are many more myths from different groups, but it's kind of hard to find some of these things. One of the myths was about this like old woman who was like a very ill-tempered woman who would go around putting out people's fires. Like she would just stomp out people's fires. And one day she passed away, and everyone was so happy that she passed away that they went to her body and they started eating different parts of her body. And so the people who ate like her arm, they started speaking one language, and the people who ate like her guts, they started speaking a different language. And as these different people ate different parts of this woman's body, that's how different languages came to be. And so it's interesting considering this idea of like hubris, a humanity's hubris that has caused the division of language. In this Aboriginal tale, or I guess a more accurate saying would be a retelling of this tale, is that the hubris of one woman confounded a bunch of people. And but I mean, what's interesting about this myth as well is that the original source from it is from like the 1800s of like a white person like record like making a record of this story. And so they don't really detail, like of course they impose their own beliefs of like, oh, cannibalism is bad onto this mythos, but like there wasn't like there's no from what I found, there was no reflection from the people themselves talking about their perspectives on this like act of cannibalism.
Mm.
So like take this with a grain of salt. uh be aware of your own cultural perceptions in this, because cannibalism is a taboo and it is a universal taboo, but there are some exceptions. But yeah, it was a very interesting thing.
What you were saying about that, story of different languages coming from cannibalism actually made me think about the world creation story when it comes to the Norse gods, because fundamentally, Odin and his brothers kill this giant and use the giant's body as the earth,
Hmm.
which kind of interesting. Not necessarily totally related, but
No, but it is interesting how often like cannibalism will come up in myths. Like in Greek myth, the goddess Athena was born through Zeus's head because he ate her. You know, and it's like interesting how a lot of these taboos, these like universal taboos will pop up in these kinds of mythos. That's like a story for another day. We're not necessarily, I mean, we could talk about it, but I'm not a sociologist by any means, and couldn't speak super accurately on it. But that is like an interesting myth that I found. And are there any other ones before I kind of like go into my little side tangent about some of these myths?
there was one other one that I wanted to share that I thought was kind of interesting, and it's from the Popol Vuh, which is the book of the Mayans, right? So I have the copy of the Popol Vuh that was the translation by Alan J. Christensen, but we talked about it a good deal and read it in one of my Spanish classes at the University of Utah when I was doing my master's there. But I think this one is really interesting because it also talks about, language being a part of the creation story. So reading directly from the Popol Vuh, they have somewhat different gods, you might say, than
Mm-hmm.
in the other stories. So you have like Heart of Sky and Quetzal Serpent here. But an interesting thing is that in their creation story, before they create people, they have the creation of the animals. And then what happens is these gods want to be worshipped, right? They want the animals to call upon them. And quoting from this translation, it says, "But they did not succeed. They did not speak like people. They only squawked and chattered and roared." And it goes on in a bit that the gods say to each other, "They were not able to speak our names." And so that's like the fall of the animals. The animals end up just serving and more or less being destroyed. And then they try to create people again. So they create people out of mud. And they say that it merely fell apart and dissolved. Its head was not set properly. Its face could only look in one direction. Its face was hidden, neither could it look about. At first it spoke, but without knowledge. And so, they figured, oh, this was a mistake, and they toppled it, and they try again to create humans out of wood. And again, that doesn't work. And so they had the appearance of people and spoke like people as well, is what it says. And then it goes on, "Nevertheless, they still did not possess their hearts nor their minds. They did not remember their framer or their shaper." And so this, attempt at creating humanity again is considered a failure. And then the actual origin story of the humans is that they were eventually created out of corn, out of
Mm-hmm.
maize, and that's what humans came from. But I thought it was really interesting that like the reasoning behind the animals not working is that they were not able to speak the name of their creators. And that's like, I just read a few phrases out of the Popol Vuh. I highly recommend anyone who's interested, like, actually read the book, look more into the history. Like, this is very much glossing over, and we definitely don't want to minimize any of these histories or cultures. But I did think it's really cool that speech was such a central part of the success of the creation of humanity.
Yeah, no, that's really cool. And you brought that up of like the Mayan, and another one that I found was about the Inca. And it's kind of a similar story, although the Inca were made out of clay. The clay actually worked for the Inca and their gods, but the creator god specifically made human beings from clay and then painted them with distinctive clothes and gave them different languages and customs. So in the Inca, it was like built in, like he made every single group and like specifically made them different from one another so that they could be distinguished from each other and then they could disperse.
So rather than the diversity being the punishment that we see in like
It
the
was
Christian
intentional.
version, it was an intended part of the creation. That's cool.
Yeah, so really interesting how all of these kind of differ. But it is kind of I think the moral of the story is like creation and like language myths kind of go hand in hand. Kind of going back to that idea that we've talked about before of like how innate is language. And for a lot of different cultures, it's just a part of being human, and it's something that like the gods worked into us, whether that's because of our own folly and our own stupidity, or as like a unique aspect of us being able to like worship them or work with them somehow. And I think this kind of ties in, especially you mentioning the Popol Vuh. This ties into the big point that I want to make about all of this. We've had a lot of fun here, friends. We've had a lot of fun chatting about this, and EJ kind of mentioned that we don't want to diminish any of these like cultures or belief systems or anything like that. But something to be mentioned is that especially in some of these like smaller, I mean, I guess I would say smaller, but I understudied, underdocumented cultures and religions. You gotta take what you find online with a grain of salt. A lot of the research that has been done on some of these things is done by white people, white men. Some of these stories aren't documented because many cultures have a tradition of oral continuation, of oral storytelling. And some cultures might not believe in documenting these things in any way, right? Like the Aboriginal story that I told, the Native Australian story that I told, it was documented in the 1800s by a white man, so it could be colored differently, it could be misinterpreted, and that can be said for a lot of these resources. So just bear that in mind, and just keep in mind that all of these myths, all of these stories are best told by the people who they belong to. And when considering things that are like culturally relative, like creation myths and certain beliefs, you need to look at it through that culture's perspective to truly understand it, and not let your own culture and background color your perception of these myths. Um,
Definitely.
so just be aware of the scholarly, or in this case, like lack of scholarly work on some of these things.
Yeah. And actually there's a really interesting point related to that with the Popol Vuh, especially like the book, it's the Mayan history, right? Of from the creation of the world and stuff, but the records that we have of the Popol Vuh, and even like this one that I have that's like a pretty well researched and like tons of annotations and stuff, it mentions Christianity,
Mhm.
right? Like there's bits because of the events with the conquistadors and with the missions trying to spread Christianity. The records that we have actually at least somewhat had some modifications and some input from the Christian conquerors.
Yeah.
And so it's not only like today looking at this, we have to acknowledge our own biases, but if the historians even centuries ago are the ones writing this, what are their biases? What are they bringing in? Can we separate that from the original works, or can we find, sources that come from before those kind of cultural clashes? It kind of comes down to, is it like the Heisenberg principle again of like with an electron, you can only know its position or its direction, but if you observe one, then you can't see the other. Like the act of observation kind of can change your output.
Mhm.
The moment that an outsider steps in to a culture to study it, that outsider is by nature interacting with that culture, and you have changes happen because of that, no matter how well and well meaning the person is.
Yeah, no, exactly. And like I said, the in the document that I found, the original document from 1874 about Australians, like in like every other paragraph they talk about how grotesque something is or how ungodly these people are, and that is like a big clue of like, okay, this might not be the most accurate resource for this type of myth just because like they're bringing in their own perspective and describing some of these things that people do based on their own like biases and such. So I agree with all of the points you made, EJ. That's just something to consider. Again, when it comes to talking about people and their belief systems, talk to the people themselves. They know best.
And don't come in with an attitude of like, I'm right. Like,
Yeah.
I'm here to spread my superior belief system. Like, no, you need to go in just willing to listen
Mhm.
and to learn and to respect those stories and cultures that you're learning about.
Yeah. It's been awesome taking a look at some of these different mythos from around the world. I hope all of our listeners have enjoyed it as well. There we might maybe another day we can talk about what it means to have these like universal myths of like the Great Flood or a tower dispersing language. Maybe we can talk about that another day. It's not necessarily linguistics related or language related, but it is interesting and kind of goes back to that idea of like universals across humanity. Maybe we can touch on that another time, but I hope that you enjoyed our little discussion here, and remember to treat everybody with kindness and respect, especially those who are of other cultures, and yeah, keep your ears open and your hearts open as well.
Yeah. And if you have any, fun stories you want to share with us, feel free to contact us on Instagram at For the Love of Language. We'd love to hear from you and hear any ideas you have for future episodes.
Yeah, or we have listeners from all over the world. If there's a myth that something from your culture that you would like to share, please let us know. We'd love to hear from you.
All right. Till next time.
Bye, friends.